Okay. We've got a few more coming in. For those of you who are joining us today, online or either in person, I'm going to give you just our texts really quickly. If you're writing these down, today's lesson will be focusing on the death of Jesus. The crucifixion. My apologies. Next week is the death, and I am teaching on the death of Jesus next week. So I'm trying not to cross over, because the divides of our text are like within like verses of each other. So we're going to try to make sure that we stay focused more on the crucifixion today. However, the crucifixion of Jesus is found in all four gospel narratives. Matthew chapter 27, verse 32 through 49, which will probably be the text that I stay in for today. Mark chapter 15, verse 21 through 36 is the Mark account. Luke 23, 26 through 43, and then John 19, verse 18 through 29. Those are the four texts for today's study. As I said, that's focused on the crucifixion. I will be in Matthew 27, verse 32 through 49 for the focus of our study today. And as I said, for those of you who are just joining us, I don't really have a lot prepared. So whatever we come up with together is what we come up with together. We'll just have to ask questions and study along on our own together, but we'll have a good time, and hopefully we will learn quite a bit. So Matthew 27, I'm focusing on Matthew for one simple point. Matthew's the first gospel. It's easy and quick to turn to. And I said, well, if I'm going to start with anything, I'm going to start with Matthew. John's account's a little on the shorter side, and John focuses on different components. John's a different thinker. When you read the gospel by John, he writes from I'm going to say a deeper level. Luke is my personal favorite gospel narrative, but Luke focuses more on the thieves on the cross and some of the narrative there, so I just chose not to go there. Matthew, in my opinion, probably borrowed heavily from Luke, and you'll find that in a lot of literature that that Luke was probably the first gospel narrative written. And if that's the case, Matthew is very similar.
Mark.
What's that?
Mark.
Did I say Luke? I meant Mark. Mark was the first gospel narrative written, and so we believe that Matthew probably borrowed from Mark. Nothing wrong with a little borrowing. I think we've probably all done it at some point in our life. You ever look over at someone's paper in grade school and just take a sentence or two? Well, Matthew probably did the same thing. But so you'll see a great similarity between Matthew and Mark's if you read the two accounts. Like I said, we'll focus on Matthew's today. Beginning in verse 32. This is Matthew 27 and verse 32. They were going out. They met a man of Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. Who do you think we're talking about when we open up in the crucifixion narrative? Who is the they? The soldiers. They're walking along, and as we see in this first section, really verse 34, they offered Jesus wine mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused. And they crucified him. So we have a lot of theys. It's focusing on the Roman soldiers who are taking him along. Now, we're introduced first off here to a man named Simon of Cyrene. I believe it's Luke's gospel, don't hold me to that actually tells us who Simon's children were, sons. I think it was Alexander and Rufus. Like I said, I read this at 6:40 this morning, so you're holding it. We're going to go off of a rough memory here, but we're told who the two sons are. We're given a little bit greater detail. Have we been introduced to Simon prior to this moment? Not this Simon. How did Simon get selected to haul the cross? He was there. This is one of those stories of being in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the right time. I don't really know Simon's story before this. I'm going to assume that Simon became a disciple because we do have record of who his children were. And you typically don't write down people's children unless it's important at some point. So I'm going to assume that Simon became a disciple.
I'm curious about the connection between the second mile story. So, Romans had the right to understand the script somebody can carry the fact or whatever. I think it was a mile, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I'm wondering if that's about a situation that's constricted. How you said it? Constricted him.
Conscripted.
There you go. Him to take that back or carry the load or whatever.
I appreciate you saying that, because something that came to my mind was Jesus' comment of a person should deny themselves, take up their cross and follow. And I thought Jesus in Simon's situation, Jesus is leading, so Simon is following, and Simon is picking up a cross. So I kind of wondered on that text, but you're observant there to say, how does this relate even to a soldier conscripting someone else? We look at this moment with Simon. Like I said, I'm going to assume that later on Simon becomes a disciple of Jesus in some way. We have no knowledge of him prior to this moment. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then we ask the question, why would they even ask Simon to carry the cross?
Because Jesus is weak enough that he could carry it.
It was very common for the future deceased to be carrying their own cross, the execution or executed one to carry their own cross. So that's very common. Jesus obviously begins by carrying his cross. He reaches a point where he cannot go any further. And mind you, the Romans were professional executors. They knew what they were doing. So when they looked at Jesus and they saw that he could no longer carry the cross, we can rest assured that Jesus was physically incapable of going much further with the cross. He spent all night up the night before. He has gone before, 3 trials by this point? 3 trials? He's been flogged, tormented, and now he's carrying a beam that, I'm gonna probably equate it to a good railroad tie. Have you ever moved a railroad tie?
It's so much word that it was 75 to 125 pounds.
Perfect. 75 to 125 pounds.
And you've had your back basically flayed.
And you're not going to carry it like this, probably. Across his back.
You probably hadn't had anything to do.
So no wonder that Jesus reaches the point where he physically cannot carry. Yes, Ms. Glenda.
What if you died on the way? What would that have done to their program?
Well, to their program, I think they probably would have kicked him aside, gone on. I
So it
don't
wasn't
know.
a big deal that he was crucified, they just wanted him dead.
The Jews wanted him crucified. The Romans, they were going to crucify him just because that's the way to do it. The Jews wanted him crucified because they wanted him to hang on a cross. Deuteronomy would tell us that a person who was hung on a tree or a cross, in the same account, would be cursed by God. The Jews wanted that. But I think at the end of the day, he was a thorn in their side and they wanted him gone. Did I see a hand back there? No? Okay. So if he had died on the way, from their accounts, I don't know if that would have been catastrophic. And I'm assuming that because I think the Jews wanted him dead. They could have killed him in a back alley somewhere, but they wanted something very public. And so I think even at that point, he would have been public enough. Good question. Any other thoughts on that?
The Jews didn't have the authority to execute.
They didn't.
The political situation between the Jews and the Romans, the Jews tolerated the hierarchy of the temple to define, what I'm saying about the Jews. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the priestly class who primarily were the well-to-do, the better off of society. They weren't the rank and file. They were the elite. And as the elite, they had businesses, they had land, they had investments. They had a lot to lose if the Romans, decided to, hey, we've had it, we're just going to wipe out these people and their religion or whatever it was. So largely they placated the Romans. They did their lip service. They probably were bribing many of the Roman officials. They had the resources, so there was probably a lot of graft and corruption. I mean, we see how politics works. It's no different today than it was in those days. And Christ was disrupting their world.
Well, that's why I said they could have killed him in some back alley. And you could stab a guy and walk away, and what's one dead Jew to a Roman? But they wanted this public. They wanted an authorized execution to the highest standard. They wanted the electric chair. That's what they were going for. And they got it.
It had to be at this time and this method. Cursed is he that hangs on a tree. Well, there was no other point in time in history where crucifixion was the preferred form of execution for a non-Roman. Had to be at this time. So the question in the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, why did you choose this backward time, this backward place, this backward time? Well, that's another answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then to take your question and say, would they have cared? Well, on a human level, may not have been a big deal, but was the cross an important level in the cosmic or godly sphere? I'm going to say yes. And I also agree, or I think that there's a reason Jesus gave up the spirit when he said it is finished. I think there's a lot of things that play into that was vital on the theological side, the godly side of things. So we have Jesus, we have Simon now carrying the cross. They get to the place that's called the skull. And does anyone know where that's at? Somewhere outside a gate.
It's a hill.
We assume it's a hill. We're actually never told definitively where the hill is. We don't know it's a garden. Some people assume that maybe it was like a place that looked like a skull. Some commentators would say that it's a place where there were skulls, like animal bones left around. I don't really know, and we can't really point to where this place was. At the end of it, though, Jesus was crucified there, and it was said not so much that we would know where the event occurred, but so that the early people who were reading or hearing the gospel narrative, they knew where this was at, and that's what mattered. They knew where they were at. And so it says here that they crucified and they offered wine and drink mixed with gall, but tasting it, he refused it. Why did they do that, and why did Jesus refuse it?
The wine with the myrrh or gall was a form of compassion that Jewish women showed to men.
and Jesus chose to experience the sensation of the cross without the deadening of the grave.
His law was a sedative, was it?
Yeah.
I mean, so it would be like going into oral surgery and, you know, the dentist is gonna go work on you without the benefit of any kind of anesthesia.
My mouth already hurts just thinking of what you're describing. But that's a great analogy.
Except it wasn't the mouth, it was, you know, the nails to the bricks.
Imagine having a tooth pulled. Imagine having a tooth pulled with no anesthesia. And I guess at that point, the dentist is just going to stand on top of you with a pair of pliers and yank. This was designed. There are some people who would say that the wine was actually like a Roman thing and it was more of a taunt. I think that's possible. I don't know. I'm going to go more with the compassion side because there's more literature that seems to point towards a compassionate approach that this is designed to help.
Isn't that in Luke's account that the women offered him the wine with the
It may be, and I would, if you find that, I'd love that. But I choose the more the compassionate side to help the one who's about to be executed receive the punishment. Then there's written this sign, verse 37 now. Yeah. Oh, actually, I don't want to jump over 34. Mixed with gall. Verse 35, when they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Now, I believe it's Luke's account that tells us that his undergarment was this one sewn piece. There was no seams in it. We come to this detail, and yet something we have to think about is a lot of this is, Matthew's focus is going to be on Old Testament prophecy. So Matthew's going to be pulling from Old Testament text to come with a lot of this stuff. He's going to be pointing backwards. Also, Matthew, I believe it's Psalm 22 that Matthew really focuses on with the crucifixion. So you could probably compare and read Psalm 22 and Matthew 27. But the thing I want to focus on is when they got his clothes, they casted lots because they didn't want to tear it up. Why is it interesting or unique that Jesus' garment was made of? Oh, go ahead.
Rerun. Luke says the soldiers also came up to mock him, and they offered him wine vinegar.
Okay.
So it don't say anything about the women that I see.
doesn't mean the other two.
Okay,
So,
you just thought that.
I have a reason for it.
There is early texts that say that women would show compassion. Like I said, there's the other side that says that this was a Roman, like it was a soldier drink, and so it was more the soldiers issuing a taunt, like they were taunting him with this. I choose to take the compassion side, but so you know, there are arguments on both sides. Thank you for finding that though, Linda. In this clothing though, we have Jesus wearing something that is sewn entirely of one piece. You know, I look at my shirt and there are seams all over the shirt. Finding a garment that's sewn entirely without seams would be pretty difficult and expensive. Why is that important?
Well, probably wasn't so, it's probably woven.
Woven.
Not been repaired.
Hasn't been repaired. What other garment in the Bible does not consist of a seam? Well, I'm not thinking of the temple curtain.
Elijah's cloak.
I don't know if Elijah did. Maybe it did. I can't remember that one. The one I'm thinking of though is the high priest's garment. The high priestly garment was a solid piece with no seams. It may be a minimal, maybe a reach, but Jesus is wearing a garment that would resemble that of a high priest, not the beauty and the decency of it, but a garment that's going to show. And if we're taking the crucifixion on a spiritual level, how important is it that the high priest is now the one who's carrying the sins of the people? Because is that not what the crucifixion's about? He's carrying the sacrifice. And by the way, this is something that we probably need to say. When we read the crucifixion narrative, our first thought is typically to look at us. Boy, it would sure hurt if they put a nail right here. Man, it would sure hurt if they put a nail through my ankles. It would sure. I'd hate the suffocation of this position for 6 hours. We think selfishly. Matthew, really the gospel narrative, the gospel story is not on a selfish perspective. Their focus is on the salvation side. So when Jesus dies on the cross, what's the real point? Does Matthew write so that we'll understand the pain? Or does Matthew write so that we'll understand the salvation? Go for it.
I was just struck by the brevity of the crucifixion and some of the gospels. And it's like, well, when you have more detail, but to your point, there were a whole lot of people crucified. And there's a whole lot of that, mankind is cruel. There's been a whole lot of even crueler things that happen to people. So it's not about the cruelty, it's about who was on that cross. That's, to me, that you speak to the point.
Who was the lamb? Which, by the way, this is also Passover, or it's the time period of Passover. By the way, the Passover lamb's also on its way to the temple, probably about the same time period. We come to a lot of things, and then you have Jesus wearing a single itemed garment representing the high priest, which, yet again, the high priest's job was to go into the temple, go into the Holy of Holies, and basically atone for the sins of all people. What happens in the crucifixion? It's the atonement of the sins of all people. So when we're looking at the pain, which the next verse really lends us to this idea even more, 36, the guards sat down. They're doing that just because, well, they've seen crucifixions. Crucifixions last a while. They're going to stand for it. I don't even want to stand for the hour Bible class I'm in here. I'm sitting on a stool for a reason. I'm lazy. Well, they're tired. They're going to sit down too. Above his head, they placed the written charge, which this is, I think it's in Luke's account where they write it in Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, or Greek, Aramaic, and I forget that. They talk about the three languages that it's written in, but it says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." You remember the Pharisees and all the higher up Jews said, no, the charge should say this is claimed to be King of the Jews. Why is that sign important?
Because it was the truth.
Because it was the truth. Even though Pilate didn't fully know, when he commissioned the sign to be made, I don't think he's sitting there with this cognitive presence saying, this is what we're doing. But he did it. And then you hang the thing up, and it just ignites the Jews with fury. But it's the truth. Greg, you look like you have a comment.
He did this as a taunt to the Jewish people that forced him, or as he sees it, forced his hand to do this. Now, we're not giving him any credit and letting him off the hook, because he did it. But this is a taunt. And as they were going through the street, they would be reading this placard or whatever, this announcement. This is Jesus Nazareth, King of the Jews. This is what happens to you if you oppose Rome.
I take it that the Romans are making a statement. If we can do this to the King of the Jews, what can we do to you? If you don't follow what we want you to do. You set an example.
Keep everyone in their place.
Yeah, keep them in line.
Mm. Thank you, Bill. We know there are two rebels coming up onto verse 38. There are two rebels crucified with him, one on the right, one on the left. Jesus seems to be in the middle. Luke gives us the greatest detail of the conversation, and it seems that one of the rebels at some point, according to Luke's gospel, converts, repents, changes, whatever. There, in this account, they are hurling accusations too. Verse 39, people passing by hurled insults, shaking their heads, saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross." The chief priests, the teachers of the law, he saved others, but can he save himself? He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and then we'll believe him. The thing that strikes me in this moment, and I'm going to try not to jump too much to the death, is how lonely would Jesus have been at this moment? Where are the disciples at?
Didn't they kind of scatter, nowhere to be found?
All but one of them
John was
seems,
there.
John, all but one, John, was there. Huh?
And the women were there.
And the women were there. Which, well, that sure is powerful, isn't it?
Can you imagine the mother, Mary, watching her son? I can't imagine the pain that she felt, seeing her son nailed up there, suffering, because as a parent, you know you'd rather hurt than have your child hurt, you know that. So, ooh, I can't.
So here he is, hanging on a cross. Those who are his, we'll say 11 of his closest friends have either hung themselves or they've deserted him in some way. One of them's still there. He does the commission where he says, "You're this now your mama." But how lonely is that moment? You got a guy on one side of each that understand the feeling of being crucified, but how lonely?
He feels like his father is turned his back on him.
How does it feel when we feel that God has abandoned us? And in this moment, was that feeling there for him? I know, and attempting not to jump forward to the death, I'm going to say, man, he takes on the sin of the world. So God has to turn his back on him because now he becomes sin. Jesus is there and he has been truly abandoned by all. Then the taunts of all the people that are coming, he could save everybody else. Could he really save himself? Verse 44, even the rebels crucified had insults for him. We look at this count, and I guess what I'm going to kind of close out at least my part of the conversation with is all of these insults and all of these are bringing up accusations, things that Jesus has said that he was going to do, destroy the temple and build it up, that he could save other people, but he couldn't save himself. In a way, they are using the words of Jesus and throwing them back into his face, saying, "You think you are able to." But yet Jesus does all of this willingly. Do you think he knew that he could destroy the temple and build it in 3 days? Huh?
Without even thinking about it.
I think he did. Do you think that Jesus thought or knew that he could save other people and could also have saved himself? I think he did. And the part that should be, I think, beautiful to us is that with all the accusations, all the pain, all the stuff that's going on, the point that Matthew writes to is that Jesus willingly took on this charge, this challenge, so that we could find a renewed relationship with God. And that's where, to me, I think the beauty of the gospel story is that in spite of what all it took, Jesus was willing to do all of this on our behalf. So that when I yell accusations, when I yell my questions, when I do the things that I do as a human that deny or belittle the role of God in this world. I have the right to do that because Jesus was willing. Any thoughts or comments before we've got just a few minutes, and if not, we'll just wrap up a little early. But
Is the, my God, my God statement, is that in the next weeks?
you know, it may, I know I
I'll
can,
step on that. I think-
Yes, it's in there. That's verse 46.
if you want to go for that, because you're right, like the 45, technically, the text that, according to our class outline, goes
I'll
through
step on
49.
that next week. I think that's a very significant statement for us as people, as followers of Christ. We often people feel guilty about feeling abandoned or feeling lost or feeling on the outside and feel like God's let them down. And this passage tells me it's part of the human nature. We need to help each other do that rather than condemn. That makes sense.
When we feel like the outcast.
Yeah.
Even Jesus was the outcast. Thank you, Mike. Well, if there's no other comments, I'll go ahead and dismiss our class. Thank you very much for your conversation, your comments and questions. And we'll look forward to worship starting up here in just a few minutes.